Why have Jews and Arabs been locked in conflict for thousands of years? What most people don't understand is that this ancient struggle isn't really about land, politics, or even religion at its deepest level. The roots of this conflict stretch back to the very beginning, to a family story that has been playing out for millennia. Today, you're going to discover the shocking biblical truth behind this endless war, and more importantly, you're going to learn something that will change how you see the entire Middle East situation forever. The story begins with one man whose decision would shape the destiny of billions. Abraham, the father of faith, received a promise from God that seemed impossible. God told him he would become the father of many nations, that through him all the families of the earth would be blessed. But there was one problem. Abraham's wife Sarah was barren. Year after year passed and still no child came. Can you imagine the weight of carrying a divine promise while watching it seemingly slip away with each passing season? As the years turned into decades, Sarah's faith began to crack under the pressure. In desperation, she made a decision that would echo through history. She told Abraham to sleep with her Egyptian servant Hagar. In their culture, this wasn't unusual, but spiritually, it was an attempt to fulfill God's promise through human effort rather than divine intervention. How often do we make the same mistake, trying to force what only God can accomplish in His timing? Abraham lay with Hagar and she conceived. The child was named Ishmael, meaning God hears, because God had heard Hagar's cry in the wilderness when she fled from Sarah's harsh treatment. For 13 years, Ishmael was Abraham's only son, the apple of his eye, the embodiment of hope and legacy. But then the impossible happened. The birth of Isaac changed everything. What had been a house of joy became a house of tension. During Isaac's weaning celebration, Sarah noticed something that filled her with alarm. The teenage Ishmael was mocking the young Isaac, and in that moment, Sarah saw a threat to her son's inheritance. Abraham's heart was torn in two. How could he send away his firstborn son? But God spoke to him clearly. "Do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." And so, with a heavy heart, Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness. This moment of separation wasn't just a family tragedy. It was the beginning of a spiritual and physical divide that continues to this day. Isaac would inherit the covenant, the promised land, and become the father of the Jewish people. Ishmael would become the father of the Arab nations. Two sons, two destinies, two peoples who would struggle with each other for generations to come. But here's what most people miss about this story. Before Ishmael was even born, God gave a prophecy about his character and destiny that sounds almost shocking to modern ears. This wasn't a curse, but a divine revelation. In the ancient world, the wild donkey represented fierce independence and untamed freedom. This was a picture of a people who would be strong, proud, and free, but also constantly in conflict. Look at the Arab world today and you'll see this prophecy fulfilled with startling accuracy. From the internal divisions between Sunni and Shia Muslims to the ongoing conflicts throughout the Middle East, the spirit of Ishmael continues to manifest exactly as the ancient prophecy foretold. The spiritual dimension of this conflict becomes even more complex when we examine how different religious traditions have interpreted Abraham's story. In Judaism and Christianity, Isaac is the son of the covenant, the one through whom God's promises flow. But in Islam, there's a crucial difference. While the Quran doesn't explicitly name which son Abraham was commanded to sacrifice, Islamic tradition teaches that it was Ishmael, not Isaac, who was placed on the altar. This might seem like a small theological detail, but it changes everything. In ancient cultures, being the son of the sacrifice meant being the chosen heir, not just of material inheritance, but of divine favor. By identifying Ishmael as the sacrificial son, Islamic tradition positions him and his descendants as the rightful heirs to Abraham's spiritual legacy. This theological divide has real-world consequences that we see playing out today. In Jerusalem, the most contested city on earth, these competing narratives collide with devastating effect. The Temple Mount, known to Muslims as Haram al-Sharif, sits at the center of this conflict. Jews revere it as the site of Solomon's temple, the most sacred place in Judaism. Muslims honor it as the place from which the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. One location, two sacred histories, two truths that seem impossible to reconcile. The foundation stone beneath the dome of the rock perfectly illustrates this dilemma. Jewish tradition teaches that this rock is the spiritual center of the universe, the place where Abraham prepared to sacrifice Isaac. Islamic tradition holds that this is where Muhammad began his night journey to heaven. Two ascensions, two stories, one stone. How can both be true? The western wall below the Temple Mount tells the same story of competing claims. For Jews, it's the last remaining connection to their ancient temple, a place of weeping and prayer where they've pressed their hopes into the cracks of ancient stones for centuries. For Muslims, it's the Barak Wall, where Muhammad tied his winged horse before his heavenly journey. Same stones, different meanings, irreconcilable truths. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this ancient conflict is how it's been weaponized in modern times. Iranian officials have repeatedly called for Israel to be wiped off the map, and this isn't just political rhetoric. Embedded in some interpretations of Islamic law is a hadith that speaks of an end-times battle where Muslims will fight Jews until the Jews hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees will cry out to expose them. The only exception is the boxthorn tree, which will remain silent to protect the hiding Jew. This prophecy has become so literalized that some believe Jews are actually planting thousands of boxthorn trees in Israeli settlements, preparing for the fulfillment of this dark vision. Whether this is paranoia or prophecy, it shows how deeply the ancient wound between Isaac and Ishmael continues to fester in the modern world. The geopolitical implications of this biblical story are staggering. The 1948 establishment of Israel wasn't seen by many Arabs as liberation, but as catastrophe, the Nakba. The mass displacement of Palestinian families, the erasure of their villages, the beginning of their long exile, all of this echoed for many the moment when Hagar and Ishmael were cast out into the desert. The feeling of being rejected, displaced, and forgotten by the world became part of the Palestinian narrative. For many in the Muslim world, Israel's existence represents more than just a political challenge. It's seen as a negation of their history, their narrative, their very identity. When Isaac was born, Ishmael didn't just lose a brother, he lost his future. He lost his place as the heir. This ancient dynamic of displacement and disinheritance continues to fuel the passion behind today's conflicts. The covenant that God made with Abraham was never meant to be shared. It was exclusive, passing through Isaac to Jacob and then to the 12 tribes of Israel. This concept of being the chosen people became the cornerstone of Jewish identity, giving them a sense of divine purpose that sustained them through persecution, exile, and near extinction. But it also became a source of tension with the world around them. How do you live as a chosen people in a world that often rejects the very idea of divine favoritism? Yet even in the midst of this ancient wound, there are signs of hope. The Bible records that when Abraham died, both Isaac and Ishmael came together to bury their father. After years of separation, after the pain of rejection and exile, the two brothers stood side by side in their grief. Jewish tradition notes that even though Ishmael was the older brother, Isaac's name is mentioned first in the biblical account. This suggests that Ishmael allowed Isaac to take the lead, an act of humility and recognition of his brother's covenant status. This moment of reconciliation at their father's grave has been seen by many as prophetic, a preview of what could still come to pass. The ancient Jewish principle that the deeds of the fathers are signs for the children suggests that this reunion wasn't just a historical footnote, but a glimpse into a future possibility. And indeed, we're beginning to see signs of this ancient prophecy stirring to life. The Abraham Accords, the peace agreements between Israel and several Arab nations, were deliberately named after the common father of both peoples. For the first time in modern memory, the focus shifted from what divided them to what united them. Arab and Jewish leaders publicly acknowledged their shared heritage, their common ancestor, their intertwined destiny. But the ultimate resolution to this ancient conflict, according to biblical prophecy, won't come through human diplomacy or political agreements. It will come through divine intervention. The Bible speaks of a time when the Messiah will return to establish his kingdom of peace, when the wolf will lie down with the lamb, when swords will be beaten into plowshares, and when the knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. The story of Isaac and Ishmael is far from over. Their descendants continue to grapple with the legacy of that ancient separation, that moment when two brothers were sent down different paths. We've seen how the ancient feud between Isaac and Ishmael set the stage for today's conflicts. But the story goes much deeper than most realize. The biblical narrative doesn't just explain the origins of this division. It actually reveals specific patterns that continue to play out in our modern world with stunning accuracy. When we examine the lives of these two brothers more closely, we discover that their individual characteristics became the spiritual DNA of entire civilizations. Isaac, the child of promise, represented a people called to be set apart, chosen for a specific divine purpose. This calling would shape the Jewish identity for millennia to come. They would be a people of the book, preserving ancient truths, maintaining their distinctiveness even in exile, and carrying the weight of covenant responsibility wherever they went. Ishmael, on the other hand, embodied something entirely different. Remember the prophetic words spoken over him while he was still in his mother's womb. He would be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. This wasn't meant as an insult, but as a description of fierce independence and untamed freedom. The Arab peoples who trace their lineage to Ishmael have indeed demonstrated the same spirit throughout history, refusing to be conquered or controlled, maintaining their proud nomadic heritage even as they built great civilizations. But here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. The Bible tells us that both sons received blessings from their father Abraham, but they were very different kinds of blessings. Isaac received the covenant blessing, the spiritual inheritance that would make his descendants a channel of divine purpose to the world. Ishmael received a material blessing, the promise of becoming a great nation with earthly power and influence. This distinction helps us understand why the conflict has persisted for so long. It's not just about land or politics, it's about two different types of inheritance, two different understandings of what it means to be blessed by God. The descendants of Isaac have often seen themselves as spiritually chosen, while the descendants of Ishmael have built their identity around earthly greatness and independence. The tension escalated dramatically when Islam emerged in the 7th century. The new faith didn't just claim spiritual authority, it presented itself as the final and complete revelation from God, correcting what it viewed as corruptions in earlier scriptures. This wasn't merely a religious disagreement, it was a fundamental challenge to the entire Jewish narrative. Consider how this played out in the story of Abraham's sacrifice. In Jewish and Christian tradition, Abraham was commanded to offer Isaac on the altar at Mount Moriah, the very place where the temple would later stand in Jerusalem. This event sealed Isaac's role as the covenant child and established Jerusalem as the spiritual center of the Jewish faith. But Islamic tradition tells a different story. While the Quran doesn't explicitly name the son who was nearly sacrificed, Islamic scholars have consistently identified him as Ishmael, not Isaac. Moreover, they place this sacrifice not in Jerusalem but in Mecca, at the very site where the Kaaba now stands. This shift isn't just theological, it's geographical and political. It moves the center of Abraham's story from Jerusalem to Mecca, from the land promised to Isaac to the homeland of Ishmael. The implications of this change are staggering. If Ishmael was the son of sacrifice, then he becomes the true heir of Abraham's covenant. The spiritual center shifts from Jerusalem to Mecca, and the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises flows through the Arab lineage rather than the Jewish one. This reframing of the narrative provides theological justification for viewing the Jewish claim to the Holy Land as illegitimate. This is why the conflict over Jerusalem is so intractable. It's not just about who controls a piece of real estate, it's about whose version of sacred history is true. The Temple Mount, known to Muslims as Haram al-Sharif, represents the collision of two incompatible truth claims. Jews see it as the site where their temple stood, where God's presence dwelled most intensely on earth. Muslims see it as the place from which Muhammad ascended to heaven, confirming Islam's role as the final revelation. Both communities have built their deepest spiritual identities around this single location. The Western Wall, the last remnant of the ancient Jewish temple, stands just meters away from the Dome of the Rock, built over the spot where Muslims believe Muhammad began his night journey to heaven. Two sacred narratives occupying the same sacred space, each claiming exclusive divine authorization. The biblical pattern of the two brothers extends beyond religious differences into the realm of national character and political behavior. Throughout history, the Jewish people have survived through adaptation, scholarship, and maintaining their distinctiveness even while scattered among the nations. This reflects Isaac's character as the child who stayed home, who inherited his father's legacy through patience and divine promise. The Arab nations, by contrast, have often expressed the Ishmaelite spirit of fierce independence and resistance to outside control. Even when they've faced overwhelming odds, they've maintained their refusal to submit to foreign domination. This explains why colonial powers found the Arab world so difficult to control, and why modern attempts at nation-building in Arab countries have often failed. The 20th century brought these ancient patterns into sharp focus with the establishment of Israel in 1948. For Jews, this represented the miraculous fulfillment of biblical prophecy, the return of Isaac's children to their promised inheritance after 2,000 years of exile. The fact that this happened just 3 years after the Holocaust seemed to confirm divine intervention in history. But for Arabs, particularly Palestinians, 1948 represented something entirely different. They called it the Nakba, the catastrophe. They saw it not as the fulfillment of ancient promises, but as a modern repetition of the original injustice, when Ishmael was cast out to make room for Isaac. The displacement of Palestinian families, the destruction of their villages, and their subsequent exile into refugee camps all seem to echo Hagar and Ishmael's expulsion into the wilderness. This parallel isn't just symbolic. Many Palestinian and Arab leaders have explicitly framed their struggle in terms of the ancient biblical narrative. They see themselves as the true children of Abraham, unjustly displaced by those who claim divine favoritism. The ongoing refugee crisis, now spanning multiple generations, reinforces this identification with Ishmael's exile. The establishment of Israel also triggered a broader theological crisis in the Islamic world. If the Jews could return to their ancient homeland and rebuild their nation after centuries of diaspora, what did this say about Islamic claims to supersede Judaism? Some Muslim scholars began to reinterpret end times prophecies, suggesting that Israel's restoration was actually a sign of the final battle between Islam and Judaism, with Islam destined to emerge victorious. This eschatological dimension adds another layer to the conflict. It's not just about current political disputes, but about competing visions of how history will end. Some radical Islamic movements have embraced the idea that the final confrontation with Israel will usher in the Messianic age, making compromise not just difficult but theologically impossible. Yet even in the midst of these seemingly irreconcilable differences, the biblical narrative offers hints of a different possibility. The story of Isaac and Ishmael doesn't end with their separation. When Abraham died, both sons came together to bury their father. For a moment, the covenant child and the wilderness child stood side by side, united in grief and respect for the man who had given them life. This scene has profound prophetic significance. Jewish tradition teaches that the actions of the patriarchs foreshadow the experiences of their descendants. If Isaac and Ishmael could overcome their differences to honor their father, perhaps their descendants can do the same. The fact that Ishmael allowed Isaac to be mentioned first in the burial account is seen as an act of recognition, acknowledging Isaac's covenant role while still claiming his place as Abraham's son. Recent developments in the Middle East have given new relevance to this ancient scene of reconciliation. The Abraham Accords signed by Israel with several Arab nations explicitly invoke the shared heritage of Isaac and Ishmael. For the first time in modern history, Arab leaders publicly acknowledged the legitimacy of Jewish claims to the land, while Jews recognized Arab nations as partners rather than enemies. These agreements represent more than political convenience. They reflect a growing recognition that the children of Abraham have more in common than what divides them. Both traditions value monotheism, both revere the same patriarchs, both emphasize justice and compassion, and both await divine intervention to establish ultimate peace on earth. The success of these peace agreements, however limited, suggests that reconciliation is possible when both sides are willing to look beyond their immediate grievances to their shared spiritual heritage. It requires recognizing that God's blessings are not zero-sum, that honoring Isaac doesn't require dishonoring Ishmael, and that the covenant promises can be fulfilled without erasing the legitimate aspirations of Abraham's other children. But this reconciliation faces enormous obstacles. Extremist elements on both sides have invested heavily in perpetuating the conflict. For some, the struggle itself has become sacred, a holy war that cannot be abandoned without betraying fundamental religious principles. These voices insist that compromise is surrender, that sharing the inheritance is theft, and that only total victory can vindicate their cause. The challenge becomes even more complex when we consider how the Isaac-Ishmael narrative has been adapted and instrumentalized by various political movements. Palestinian nationalism, Iranian revolutionary ideology, Jewish religious Zionism, and Christian evangelical prophecy all draw from the same biblical story but reach radically different conclusions about its meaning and implications. Some Christian interpretations, for example, see the restoration of Israel as a necessary prelude to the second coming of Christ, making support for Jewish claims a theological imperative. Others emphasize Jesus' call to love enemies and make peace, viewing the conflict as a test of whether Christians will choose reconciliation over tribalism. Similarly, within Islam, there are voices calling for a more nuanced understanding of the Abraham story. Some Muslim scholars argue that the Quran's respect for Jews as people of the book should override political hostilities, and that true Islamic values require justice and compassion even toward enemies. Within Judaism itself, there's an ongoing debate about whether the return to the land requires displacing others or whether it can be accomplished through peaceful coexistence. Some Jewish voices emphasize the prophetic vision of Israel as a light to the nations, suggesting that the covenant blessing is meant to benefit all of Abraham's children, not just Isaac's descendants. These internal debates within each tradition offer hope that the ancient story can be reinterpreted in ways that promote peace rather than perpetuate conflict. But such reinterpretation requires courage, humility, and a willingness to see the divine image even in one's enemies. The question facing our generation is whether we will continue to replay the ancient drama of sibling rivalry, or whether we can write a new chapter in the story of Abraham's children. As we've explored the biblical roots of Jewish-Arab tensions through the stories of Isaac and Ishmael, we must now examine how these ancient patterns manifest in today's most volatile conflicts. The bloodshed we witness across the Middle East isn't random violence. It's the continuation of spiritual warfare that began thousands of years ago in Abraham's household. Look at Gaza. Every rocket launched, every life lost, every cry for justice echoes with the same themes we discovered in Genesis. The Palestinians, many of whom trace their lineage to Ishmael, see themselves as the dispossessed children cast into the wilderness. Their narrative mirrors Hagar's exile, the rejection they felt when Israel was established in 1948. They call it the Nakba, the catastrophe, and in their collective memory it's the same story, Isaac displacing Ishmael once again. Meanwhile, Israelis see themselves as Isaac's heirs, the covenant people returning to their promised inheritance after centuries of exile and persecution. The Holocaust burned into their collective soul the understanding that survival depends on strength, that never again will they be defenseless. When they look at Gaza, they don't just see rockets, they see the fulfillment of that ancient prophecy about Ishmael, his hand against everyone, everyone's hand against him. But the conflict runs deeper than territory. It's theological. In Islamic tradition, Jerusalem isn't just another city, it's the third holiest site in Islam, where Muhammad ascended to heaven from the very rock where Jews believe Abraham prepared to sacrifice Isaac. Two sacred narratives, two claims to divine favor, occupying the same 35 acres of stone and earth. The Temple Mount stands as the physical manifestation of this spiritual divide. Jews weep at the Western Wall below, mourning their destroyed temple and praying for its restoration. Muslims worship at the Al-Aqsa Mosque above, defending what they see as Islam's rightful inheritance. Every stone tells a different story. Every prayer carries a different claim to Abraham's legacy. Iran's involvement adds another layer to this ancient drama. The Persian Empire that once freed the Jews from Babylonian exile has become their greatest modern threat. Iran's leaders don't just speak of destroying Israel in political terms, they frame it as religious destiny. They see themselves as champions of the oppressed Ishmael against the privileged Isaac. Their nuclear program isn't just about regional power, it's about fulfilling what they believe is prophetic destiny. Hamas and Hezbollah operate as Iran's proxies, but their motivation runs deeper than geopolitics. Their charters explicitly reference Islamic end times prophecies about the final battle between Muslims and Jews. They're not just fighting for Palestinian liberation. They believe they're participating in cosmic warfare foretold in their sacred texts. The Sunni-Shia divide within Islam itself reflects that prophecy about Ishmael living in conflict with his brothers. Syria tears itself apart, Yemen bleeds endlessly. Iraq struggles with sectarian violence. The wild donkey spirit, fierce and free but unable to find lasting peace, manifests in the Arab world's internal struggles just as Genesis predicted. Saudi Arabia's recent openness to Israel through the Abraham Accords represents something unprecedented. For the first time, some Arab nations are choosing pragmatism over ideology, economic cooperation over ancestral grievance. They're acting like Isaac and Ishmael at Abraham's burial, putting aside their differences to honor their common father. Yet extremist voices on both sides reject this reconciliation. Jewish settlers who see every compromise as betrayal of God's promise to Isaac. Palestinian militants who view any recognition of Israel as abandonment of Ishmael's claim. Iranian ayatollahs who preach that peace with the Zionist entity equals apostasy. The spiritual warfare plays out in seemingly secular conflicts. When a Jewish family moves into East Jerusalem, it's not just about housing, it's about covenant inheritance. When a Palestinian teenager throws stones at Israeli soldiers, it's not just about occupation, it's about the cry of the dispossessed. Every news headline carries the weight of ancient prophecy. European and American attempts at peace negotiations often fail because they treat this as a political problem requiring political solutions. But you cannot solve a spiritual conflict with purely material remedies. The roots go too deep, the wounds too sacred, the competing narratives too fundamental to identity itself. Even the geography seems cursed by this ancient division. The land that was supposed to flow with milk and honey has become synonymous with conflict. Bethlehem, where the Prince of Peace was born, sits behind concrete walls. Jerusalem, the city of peace, knows no rest. The Jordan River that parted for Joshua now separates hostile nations. Climate change intensifies these ancient tensions as water becomes scarcer, making every drop a source of potential conflict. The desert that shaped both Isaac and Ishmael's descendants now threatens to reclaim the fertile lands they fight over. Environmental crisis merges with spiritual warfare in ways the ancient prophets could have hardly imagined. Technology amplifies every grievance. Social media spreads both truth and propaganda at lightning speed. A single incident in Jerusalem can spark riots across the Muslim world within hours. Ancient hatreds find new platforms, and every generation inherits not just the land, but the accumulated trauma of their ancestors. Yet within this darkness, lights flicker. Israeli and Palestinian doctors work together in hospitals, saving lives regardless of ethnicity. Jewish and Arab citizens of Israel build businesses together. Christian peacemakers from both communities risk their lives to build bridges across the divide. These modern peacemakers understand something profound. The story of Isaac and Ishmael doesn't have to end in perpetual conflict. At Abraham's tomb in Hebron, pilgrims from both traditions still come to honor their common father. That shared reverence hints at possibilities beyond the current hatred. The path forward requires more than political agreements or economic incentives. It demands spiritual transformation, the kind that can only come when people choose to see their enemies as brothers, when they remember that both Isaac and Ishmael were blessed by the same God. The ultimate resolution may require divine intervention of the kind prophesied in Scripture. But until that day comes, the choice remains before each generation. Will they perpetuate the cycle of revenge, or will they choose the harder path of reconciliation that honors both their father Abraham and the God who blessed both his sons? Throughout history, the roots of Jewish-Arab conflict have extended far deeper than most realize, weaving through the very fabric of biblical prophecy and divine revelation. What we've witnessed in the previous segments of this story, the separation of Isaac and Ishmael, the establishment of competing narratives, and the ongoing tension over sacred sites, has shaped not just the Middle East, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. But there's a dimension to this ancient struggle that goes beyond politics, beyond territory, and even beyond religious differences. It touches the very heart of what it means to be chosen by God and the weight that such divine election carries through the generations. The concept of chosenness has been both Israel's greatest blessing and its heaviest burden. From the moment God called Abraham out of Ur, declaring that through his seed all nations would be blessed, a spiritual target was placed upon this lineage. Isaac inherited this divine calling, and through him it passed to Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. The 12 tribes that emerged from Jacob's sons became the vehicle through which God would reveal himself to the world. Yet with this extraordinary privilege came an equally extraordinary responsibility. The Jewish people were not chosen for comfort but for service. They were not selected for ease but for endurance. They became the carriers of monotheism in a polytheistic world, the guardians of divine law in a lawless age, and the witnesses to God's faithfulness through millennia of persecution and exile. This divine election, however, created what we might call the Isaac complex, a deep-seated understanding that their survival and prosperity were not just matters of national interest, but of cosmic significance. Every threat to Israel became, in their understanding, a threat to God's plan for humanity. Every attempt at their destruction was seen as an assault on the divine purpose itself. Meanwhile, the descendants of Ishmael developed what we could term the wilderness consciousness, a profound sense of being overlooked, marginalized, and forced to prove their worth in a world that seemed to favor their younger brother's lineage. The prophecy that Ishmael would be a wild donkey of a man wasn't merely describing his character. It was revealing his destiny as one who would never fully submit to the established order, who would always challenge the status quo. This wilderness consciousness manifested itself in remarkable ways throughout history. The Arab peoples, true to their Ishmaelite heritage, became masters of survival in harsh conditions. They developed nomadic wisdom, desert navigation skills, and a fierce independence that allowed them to thrive where others perished. Their poets sang of honor, hospitality, and the nobility of the wandering life. Their warriors became legendary for their courage and tactical brilliance. When Islam emerged in the 7th century, it provided a theological framework that elevated this wilderness consciousness into a divine mission. The Prophet Muhammad, believed by Muslims to be a direct descendant of Ishmael through his son Kedar, presented a revelation that positioned the children of Ishmael not as the forgotten ones, but as the final arbiters of Abraham's legacy. The Quran's narrative of Abraham's sacrifice, while not explicitly naming the son, was interpreted by Islamic tradition as referring to Ishmael, not Isaac. This subtle but profound shift transformed the entire dynamic. Suddenly, it wasn't Isaac who was the chosen sacrifice, the beloved son willing to die for God's purposes. It was Ishmael. This reframing elevated Ishmael from the cast-out son to the preferred son, from the wilderness wanderer to the true inheritor of Abraham's spiritual legacy. This competing narrative created what scholars call parallel chosenness, two peoples both claiming Abraham as their father, both asserting divine election, both convinced that they hold the key to humanity's relationship with God. The conflict between Isaac and Ishmael thus transcended the personal and became theological, transcended the familial and became civilizational. The establishment of Islam didn't just create another religion, it created an alternative version of sacred history. Where Judaism and Christianity saw a linear progression from Abraham through Isaac to Jacob to Moses to Jesus, Islam presented a corrective arc from Abraham through Ishmael to Muhammad. This wasn't merely a different interpretation. It was a competing revelation claiming to restore the original truth that had been corrupted over time. The implications of this theological divergence cannot be overstated. When the early Muslim armies swept out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, they weren't just conquering territory. They were reclaiming what they believed was rightfully theirs. The rapid expansion of Islam across the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond wasn't merely military conquest. It was the fulfillment of God's promise to make Ishmael into a great nation. Jerusalem became the focal point of this theological collision. When the Muslim general Umar ibn al-Khattab entered Jerusalem in 638 CE, he wasn't just capturing a city. He was, in Islamic understanding, liberating Abraham's true inheritance. The construction of the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount wasn't merely an architectural achievement. It was a theological statement that the children of Ishmael had returned to claim their father's legacy. This historical backdrop helps explain why the modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict carries such profound emotional and spiritual weight for both sides. It's not just about land, water rights, or political sovereignty. At its deepest level, it's about two peoples wrestling with competing claims to divine favor, both tracing their legitimacy back to the same patriarch, both convinced that their narrative represents the true fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. The establishment of Israel in 1948 reactivated ancient prophetic patterns in ways that many didn't fully comprehend at the time. For the Jewish people, it represented the miraculous fulfillment of biblical prophecies about the return to the land. After nearly 2 millennia of exile, the children of Isaac were home. The Hebrew language was revived, the desert was made to bloom, and Jerusalem was once again under Jewish control. To many, this seemed like clear evidence of divine vindication. But for the Arab world, particularly the Palestinians, 1948 represented something entirely different. It was the Nakba, the catastrophe, a modern reenactment of Hagar and Ishmael being cast out into the wilderness. The displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians echoed the ancient pattern of the elder son being supplanted by the younger. The narrative of exile and wandering that had defined Jewish history for centuries was now being experienced by the descendants of Ishmael. This role reversal created a profound psychological and spiritual crisis. The people who had been the masters of the Middle East for over a millennium suddenly found themselves displaced, divided, and struggling for recognition. The children of the wilderness who had built the great Islamic civilizations of Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo now found themselves scattered and stateless. The response to this perceived injustice manifested in various forms of resistance, from secular nationalism to religious fundamentalism. Pan-Arabism attempted to unite the scattered children of Ishmael under a single political banner. Islamic revivalism sought to restore the Ummah, the global Muslim community, to its former glory. Both movements drew deeply from the well of Ishmaelite identity, the refusal to submit, the determination to resist, and the conviction that their time of vindication would come. Yet underneath all the political maneuvering and military conflicts, The spiritual dimension of this struggle continued to pulse with ancient rhythms. The prophecy that Ishmael's hand would be against everyone and everyone's hand against him seemed to be playing out not just in the conflict with Israel, but in the internal divisions that plagued the Arab and Muslim world. The split between Sunni and Shia Islam, the rivalry between different Arab nations, the conflicts in Syria, Yemen, and Iraq, all of these seem to echo the prophetic warning about Ishmael dwelling in hostility toward his brothers. The fierce independence that was Ishmael's strength had also become in many ways his curse. The inability to unite, the tendency toward fragmentation, the cycles of internal conflict. These patterns suggested that the ancient prophecy was still unfolding. Meanwhile, the children of Isaac faced their own prophetic challenges. The promise that they would be a blessing to all nations carried with it the burden of moral responsibility. How they treated their neighbors, how they exercised power, how they balanced security with justice. All of these became tests of their chosenness. The very success of the modern state of Israel raised uncomfortable questions about the price of survival and the nature of divine election. The nuclear age added new dimensions to these ancient conflicts. The possibility of weapons of mass destruction in the hands of nations driven by prophetic conviction created scenarios that seemed to echo the apocalyptic visions of the biblical prophets. When Iranian leaders spoke of wiping Israel off the map, they weren't just engaging in political rhetoric. They were expressing a theological conviction rooted in their understanding of end-times prophecy. The development of Israel's own nuclear capabilities represented a modern version of the divine protection that had preserved the Jewish people through millennia of persecution. These were no longer just regional conflicts. They were confrontations between peoples whose identities were forged in the fires of biblical prophecy, whose understanding of their role in history was shaped by ancient promises and warnings. The stakes weren't just political or economic, they were cosmic. The fate of God's plan for humanity seemed to hang in the balance. Yet even in the midst of these seemingly intractable conflicts, signs of hope continued to emerge. The Abraham Accords weren't just diplomatic agreements. They were prophetic echoes of that moment when Isaac and Ishmael stood together at their father's grave. The normalization of relations between Israel and several Arab nations suggested that the ancient brothers might yet find their way back to each other. The growth of interfaith dialogue, the emergence of peace movements within both communities, the quiet work of reconciliation happening at grassroots levels. All of these pointed toward the possibility that the cycle of conflict might not be eternal. Perhaps the deeds of the fathers, which had cast such long shadows over their children, might yet be transformed from curses into blessings. But such transformation would require something more profound than political agreements or economic partnerships. It would require a fundamental shift in how both peoples understood their identity and their calling. It would require the children of Isaac to embrace their role as a blessing to all nations, including the children of Ishmael. It would require the children of Ishmael to find ways to channel their fierce independence and prophetic calling into constructive rather than destructive purposes. Most challenging of all, it would require both peoples to grapple with the possibility that God's plan for humanity might be large enough to encompass both of Abraham's sons, that the divine election of Isaac didn't necessarily mean the divine rejection of Ishmael, and that the promises made to both could be fulfilled without canceling each other out. The story of Isaac and Ishmael is far from over. Their descendants continue to shape the world, to struggle with ancient prophecies, and to search for their place in God's unfolding plan. Whether that plan leads to ultimate reconciliation or final judgment remains one of the great mysteries of our time. We've traced the ancient origins of this conflict through Isaac and Ishmael, witnessed how prophetic patterns continue to unfold, and explored the sacred tensions surrounding Jerusalem. But the story doesn't end in perpetual hostility. Today, something extraordinary is happening. Signs of reconciliation are emerging from the most unexpected places. In September 2020, the world witnessed something remarkable. For the first time in decades, Arab nations publicly extended their hands toward Israel. The Abraham Accords, signed by the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and later other nations, weren't just political agreements. They were spiritual declarations. By invoking Abraham's name, these nations acknowledged what prophets and mystics have always known. Jews and Muslims share the same Father, the same spiritual DNA, the same divine calling. This wasn't coincidence, it was providence. After centuries of division, world leaders stood before cameras and declared that what unites them is greater than what divides them. They chose to honor their shared patriarch rather than perpetuate the wounds of his children. Yet these accords represent only the beginning, a foreshadowing of something far more profound that Scripture promises is coming. But the seeds of reconciliation aren't just sprouting in diplomatic chambers. In the hidden corners of both traditions, something beautiful has been growing for centuries. Jewish Kabbalah and Islamic Sufism, the mystical streams of both faiths, speak remarkably similar languages. Both describe the soul as a traveler ascending through spiritual worlds to return to its divine source. Both speak of God as infinite, boundless light. Both describe a love so consuming it burns away ego, fear, and identity until only union with the divine remains. Imagine a Jewish mystic and a Muslim mystic meeting not to debate theology but to weep in awe before the same presence. In the realm of spirit, labels begin to fade. What matters is the fire of longing for God. If they can see the same light, reach toward the same heaven, then reconciliation isn't just possible, it's inevitable. Contemporary voices are beginning to echo this ancient truth. Christian Arab pastors and Jewish rabbis have started meeting in Jerusalem not to convert each other but to pray together for peace. Palestinian and Israeli believers gather in underground churches, breaking bread as one family despite the political tensions raging above them. These aren't just feel-good stories, they're prophetic previews of what's coming. The transformation is happening in human hearts first, then flowing outward into communities, and eventually the Bible promises it will reshape entire nations. This is how God works, from the inside out, from the personal to the political, from the spiritual to the visible. The Apostle Paul saw this vision clearly when he wrote that Christ has broken down the dividing wall of hostility between peoples, creating one new humanity from two. But perhaps the most stunning sign of coming reconciliation lies hidden in a single verse that most people read without understanding its prophetic weight. Genesis 25, verse 9. Just one sentence, but within it lies a world of meaning. After years of separation, pain, and exile, Isaac and Ishmael stood side by side once more. There was no argument, no battle for inheritance, no renewed conflict. Only two sons mourning their father. For that moment, the covenant holder and the wilderness wanderer became simply brothers again. According to Jewish tradition, the order of their names isn't accidental. Isaac is mentioned first, even though Ishmael was older, suggesting that Ishmael allowed Isaac to take the lead. An act of humility and spiritual surrender that Jewish sages see as a preview of ultimate reconciliation. That ancient burial scene is more than historical record, it's prophecy. The principle that the deeds of the fathers are signs for the children means this moment of unity points toward a future when their descendants will also choose reconciliation over revenge, brotherhood over bitterness. The very fact that both sons honored their father despite their complicated history suggests that something deeper than political disagreement connects them. A shared identity, a common source, a divine destiny that transcends human division. Today's Abraham Accords are modern echoes of that ancient burial. Arab leaders choosing diplomacy with Israel, Jewish communities reaching out to Muslim neighbors, Palestinian and Israeli believers worshiping together. These aren't isolated incidents. They're birth pangs of the future the Bible foretells, where the children of Abraham will finally fulfill their father's blessing to become a blessing to all nations. This reconciliation won't come through human wisdom or political maneuvering alone. It requires something supernatural, something only God can accomplish. It demands hearts transformed by divine love, minds renewed by heavenly perspective, and souls surrendered to a purpose greater than national identity or religious tradition. But when it comes, and Scripture promises it will, the world will witness the greatest miracle of reconciliation in human history. The conflict between Isaac and Ishmael's descendants isn't just about land or politics, it's about identity, inheritance, and divine calling. But the same God who promised both sons would become great nations has also promised that their hostility won't last forever. But this ancient story isn't finished yet, and neither is our modern world. Because as we've seen throughout this series, the patterns of the past continue to echo into the present, and the prophecies written thousands of years ago are still unfolding before our eyes. The question that haunts every generation remains: can there truly be peace between the children of Isaac and the children of Ishmael? The answer, remarkably, may already be written in the very pages that began this conflict. You see, the Bible doesn't just diagnose the problem between Jews and Arabs, it prescribes the solution. And that solution is neither political nor military. It's spiritual, and it's more radical than anything the world has ever attempted. Throughout this journey, we've witnessed how the ancient rivalry between Isaac and Ishmael has manifested in countless ways. From the displacement of Hagar and her son to the competing claims over Jerusalem's Temple Mount. From the rise of Islamic empires to the establishment of modern Israel. Every chapter of this story has been marked by the same underlying tension. Who is the true heir of Abraham's promise? But what if we've been asking the wrong question? What if the real issue isn't about choosing between Isaac and Ishmael, but about understanding that both were always part of a larger divine plan? The Bible reveals something extraordinary. God never intended for this conflict to be permanent. Hidden within the ancient texts are clues pointing toward an ultimate reconciliation. one that transcends human politics and touches the very heart of divine purpose. After years of separation, after the pain of exile and the weight of competing destinies, the two brothers stood together at their father's grave. No argument, no battle for supremacy, just two sons honoring the man who gave them life. Jewish tradition notes that Isaac, though younger, is mentioned first, suggesting that Ishmael deferred to his brother, showing respect for the covenant bearer. This moment of reconciliation wasn't accidental, it was prophetic. The ancient Jewish principle of Ma'aseh Avot Siman Lebanim, the deeds of the fathers are signs for the children, suggests that this reunion was more than historical fact. It was a preview of what could be, a divine hint that peace between their descendants is not only possible but destined. And we're beginning to see glimpses of this prophecy fulfilled in our own time. The Abraham Accords, signed in recent years between Israel and several Arab nations, weren't just political agreements. They were named after the very Father who connects these peoples, acknowledging that beneath centuries of conflict lies a shared heritage, a common origin, a mutual inheritance from the man who first heard God's call to leave his homeland and journey toward an unknown promise. But the Bible points to something even more profound than political peace treaties. In the deepest mystical traditions of both Judaism and Islam, there has always been a recognition of spiritual unity. Jewish Kabbalists and Islamic Sufis, despite their theological differences, have described remarkably similar experiences of the divine. Both speak of the soul's journey through ascending spiritual worlds. Both describe God as infinite light. Both understand that ultimate reality transcends the boundaries that divide us in this world. Perhaps most significantly, both traditions maintain that in the end times there will be a great reconciliation. Islamic prophecy speaks of Jesus returning to establish justice and peace on earth. Jewish prophecy anticipates the Messiah who will gather the scattered tribes and bring harmony to the nations. Christian prophecy describes the same figure accomplishing both missions, uniting not just Jews and Arabs but all peoples under the banner of divine love. This convergence isn't coincidental. It suggests that the God of Abraham has been preparing for this moment throughout history, weaving together the threads of seemingly contradictory narratives into a tapestry of ultimate redemption. The conflict between Isaac and Ishmael was never meant to be the end of the story. It was meant to be the beginning of something far greater. Today, as we watch headlines filled with Middle Eastern tensions, as we witness the ongoing struggles between Israelis and Palestinians, as we see the broader conflicts that seem to pit the Jewish and Arab worlds against each other, we might despair that peace is impossible. But the Bible offers a different perspective. It suggests that these very conflicts are birth pangs, the necessary struggles that precede a new kind of peace. This peace won't come through military might or political maneuvering alone. It will come through recognition of a shared spiritual heritage, through acknowledgement that both peoples have been blessed by the same God, through understanding that the covenant given to Isaac was never meant to diminish the promise made to Ishmael. God's blessings are not finite resources that must be hoarded or fought over. They are infinite expressions of divine love that expand rather than contract when shared. The key to this reconciliation lies in returning to the source, to Abraham himself. Not Abraham the warrior or Abraham the patriarch of competing nations, but Abraham the friend of God, the man who showed us what it means to trust in divine promises even when they seem impossible to fulfill. Both Isaac and Ishmael inherited this legacy of faith, this capacity to believe in something greater than themselves, and perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. The conflict between Jews and Arabs will not be resolved by proving one side right and the other wrong. It will be resolved by recognizing that both sides are part of the same story, both chapters in the same divine narrative, both expressions of the same fundamental human longing for meaning, purpose, and connection to the sacred. The Bible's answer to why Jews and Arabs are always at war is ultimately not about war at all. It's about a family reunion that has been thousands of years in the making. It's about two brothers who were separated in childhood but who are destined to stand together again, not as competitors for their father's inheritance, but as co-heirs of a promise too large for any one people to contain. As we close this exploration, the question remains: will we choose to be agents of division or instruments of peace? Will we perpetuate the ancient rivalries or help fulfill the ancient prophecies of reconciliation? The story of Isaac and Ishmael teaches us that the choice is ours to make, and the consequences of that choice will echo through generations yet to come. The Bible has given us the answer to why this conflict exists, but more importantly, it has shown us the path to resolution. The question now is whether we have the courage to walk that path, to choose the harder road of forgiveness and understanding over the easier path of perpetual conflict. The children of Abraham, all of us, stand at a crossroads. Which direction we choose will determine not just the future of the Middle East, but the future of humanity itself.